On July the 12th, the special arbitration will issue a ruling initiated at the unilateral request of the Philippines. In recent days, the U.S. has been patrolling in the South China Sea, where the Chinese have been conducting routine military drills. Philippine policymakers have suggested the country is under pressure from Washington to find issues with China. Washington still embraces the pivot to Asia strategy, or whatever substitute phrase one might want to use. China rises nevertheless, apparently suggesting Asia and the Pacific region is big enough for all. I'm Tian Wei at the CCTV headquarters in Beijing, joined by well-respected Chinese and American policymakers and scholars trying to figure out how the arbitration ruling will impact this relationship between the world's two big powers. Is a showdown looming in the South China Sea between China and the U.S. after the arbitration ruling is issued? How significant a role do these two countries' militaries play in their foreign policies? And how might the South China Sea dispute impact U.S.-China relations, both militarily and otherwise? Douglas Paul, Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a well-known American China hand. Joe Ball, Senior Colonel in the Foreign Affairs Office of the Ministry of National Defense, representing a perspective from the Chinese military. And Yuan Peng, Vice President of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, well-known China-U.S. relations scholar from the country. Welcome to the three of you to our special program, Troubled Waters of World Insight. Senior Colonel Zhou, yes. What might happen after the ruling comes out?
Well, first of all, it depends on what kind of ruling will really come out. And definitely there would be responsible from the Chinese government, from the Filipino government, and finally the U.S. government, and actually the whole world.
But many wonder, Mr. Yuan, whether it's going to be a showdown between China and the Philippines or China and the United States.
I think from a mainstream perspective of China, it's between China and both the United States and the Philippines. Many suggested that maybe the United States is behind of the case of the Philippines.
Mr. Paul, of course, you heard the name, the United States. How would you respond to your Chinese colleagues?
Well, I think that there's a lot of suspicion of U.S. involvement in this case, which is misplaced. The case was brought, yes, with an American lawyer, but one retained by the Philippine government without any involvement of the United States government, and someone who's had experience with this kind of trial before. My own expectation is that there's going to be less coming out of this arbitration panel's findings than people fear will occur. The scope of the court's jurisdiction is much narrower than a lot of journalism suggests that it is.
Some suspect after the ruling, U.S. is going to step up its patrol if China, as it has already said, is not going to accept whatever the ruling is. And while China has been suspected by others of having the plan to establish ADIZ, what do you think might be the two sides' reactions to whatever the ruling is?
Both sides have a range of options. I think that it would be a big mistake for both China and the U.S. to think that it was important after the ruling to step up their military operations. In fact, I think both sides have stepped up their operations in preparation for the tribunal's findings in order to sort of show that they have presence. China is now conducting a military exercise near the Paracel or Xixia Islands, and the U.S. has been conducting more routine patrols in the South China Sea waters. I hope that people will take the arbitration panel as a time to, as we say, clear our throats, say what we have to say, and then lower the tensions, reduce the amount of military activity, and get back to more normal diplomacy.
Have we cleared our throat? To clear the throat for what, Senior Colonel Zhou?
Well, I think our throat is always clean. Well, the thing is the U.S. probably is coughing too loudly in the South China Sea because of the so-called militarization. Actually, the U.S. wasn't that much concerned about sovereignty issue a few years ago, but since 2012, I think they have stepped up their voice, particularly at such forum like Shangri-La dialogue, almost in a systematic way. So we have to take that into account.
But the U.S., according to you, is a systematic approach. But what about from the Chinese side? Is it more responsive approach toward what the U.S. has said or acted?
Well, I think we are quite driven at the end of our patience because given the fact that a lot of islands were taken by other countries, but China has never threatened to take them back by force. So if that is the case, then how can we safeguard our sovereignty? We're only enlarging the islands under our own control. That is the minimum disturbing thing that we can possibly do to safeguard our sovereignty.
Reactive rather from the Chinese side, Mr. Paul.
Well, I think both sides believe they're reacting to each other. This is a big part of the definition of a classic security dilemma. I protect my interests, you see my protection as a threat to your interests, so you protect your interests, and you end up on an escalatory ladder. It's important for leaders, especially civilian leaders, to determine when that's not a productive path to remain on. I hope we find that time comes just after the July 12 ruling, when the governments decide to become more civilianized and diplomatic in their approach. We have a new situation in the Philippines, a new president, a new foreign minister. The foreign minister says he wants to send a special envoy to China after the 12th. I think we ought to let diplomacy play its hand in this at that time.
Really? Are we going to have a diplomacy immediately?
Actually, the fact is that the dispute is between China and the Philippines. Even it's not related to Chinese-American relations. However, because American very positively involved into this troubled water, make the waters even trouble. So the problem is that it's a test. Arbitrational case is a test for both Philippines and the United States. For Filipino, I think if the new president wants to improve the relations, he should be very carefully to make it less visible and handle it in a proper way. And for the United States, if the United States want to play a constructive role, very responsible balancer, it should be very cautiously, should be very quiet, not like today, make it very visible chaos. So it's a test for both the United States and
How much do you think, Mr. Paul, U.S. is likely to score in such a test as being said by Mr. Yuan?
The U.S. is there because we believe in freedom of navigation and because our friends and allies have asked us to be more present because they feel they're being overbalanced by Chinese presence. How we do this is really a delicate process. It can be done badly, as happened in the 1930s, or it can be done more successfully. I'm hoping that we will see a less military color to America's efforts and that we see a more civilian diplomatic approach to managing this issue going forward after the 12th of July. The American people will not want to see the U.S. simply leave and give in to Chinese pressure, and China's people will not be happy if their government yields to American pressure. That means the two civilian governments need to take the pressure off simultaneously and move on to a diplomatic track for settling these issues.
What do you make of the possibility? After all, the two military, as I said, are in the waters over there.
I wish the award would be a turning point for the U.S. to reduce its military presence in the waters to make it less troubled, because the thing is the United States cannot praise Chinese say being professional in keeping distance with the American ships sailing in the waters. The point is, even if you quote Q's or RB to justify your purposes, the point is all these encounters are planned by the U.S. So you are not there unintentionally because you have the intention to come here. So there is a problem on Chinese side to read your intention. If Chinese read your intention as hostile or as an increasing hostility, then the will at the Chinese side to become, quote, your quote professional would become less and less.
Well, Mr. Paul, may I just reinterpret what I consider as Senior Colonel Zhou's words? He seemed to be suggesting if the U.S. is still there in the South China Sea doing the so-called patrol in what the U.S. call international waters after the ruling from the arbitration, the U.S. is really showing its true color of not necessarily being a go-betweener, but rather one with bias. Do you take that?
Well, I don't think the U.S. sees itself as a go-between. The U.S. is there to support its allies and friends, so it's not an unbiased position. The question for me is whether the U.S. conducts routine freedom of navigation and other operations in international waters owned by no one, and does it quietly or does it with a lot of loud rhetoric. I think the rhetoric has been counterproductive, and it's producing a necessity for China to respond in kind because of the normal iteration of public diplomacy. It would be wise for the United States to dial back the rhetoric and have civilians rather than military officials speak on these issues and to try to speak in ways that are constructive to a solution.
Senator Colonel Zhou?
Well, Mr. Powell, it's interesting for you to mention freedom of navigation twice, but as you know, because we are all professional, let me be honest with you. We just can't win the other side on this concept of freedom of navigation. If we talk about Article 58 of UNCLOS, you often would quote the first paragraph to say all countries enjoy the freedom of navigation over flight, but China say yes, we agree, but look at the paragraph 3. While you're performing such kind of freedom of navigation over flight, you must show due regard to the interests of littoral states. So the reason
Meaning
behind,
China.
yeah, in this case, it's the coast of China. So as we all know, UNCLOS is a product of a compromise of 9 years. So we cannot justify our own position because there are so many loopholes in this holy Bible of maritime domain.
Will civilian leadership do a different way, Mr. Paul?
Well, I would hope so. I think that, again, having constant publicity to transits, freedom of navigation exercises, which have only been a few, but normally we don't talk about them. Why are we talking about them now is my question. We should lower our profile, do our business, and try not to be seen as stirring up Chinese nationalist sentiment. That's only counterproductive to the long-term resolution of these issues in the South China Sea.
All of you have been talking about the civilian leadership vis-a-vis the military taking its part in the national policy decision-making process. This is interesting because we are seeing at a time in which the UK, for example, just came out with this Chilcot report suggesting the role of the British military of being a can-do spirit during the build-up to the war in Iraq, totally pushing the agenda without having more scrutiny from the society about that war. But the question is, Mr. Yuan, I put that question example over here, is to illustrate how much should the military play their roles in our national decision-making process, both in the United States, as Mr. Paul just mentioned several times, and also here in China. And Senior Colonel Zhou, you don't have to worry about that. I'm going to come back to you later. So, Mr. Yuan.
Actually, in China, I don't think we have some big problem because we always say that the party command the military. So no big problem between the military and the civilian relations. However, in the States, we always see this kind of problems in history and in particular in the current situation. And according to American media and also according to some higher rank officials complaint that in the States today, the White House is hard to handle the Pentagon. Sometimes the Pentagon has its own voice. Some other times maybe the PECON, performed in its own opinion. So that's why today we see the water becoming even more trouble. Many suggested that it's not because of the White House, or the State Department, but because of the Pentagon.
Okay, a lot of criticism of the U.S. system. What about here in China, Senior Colonel Zhou? The military seem to be the cheerleader for more participation militarily in the South China Sea issue?
I don't think so, because I believe we have been quite restrained in the South China Sea. There's one interesting phenomenon in Sino-US relationship, that is both leaders attach great importance to the inter-military relationship. That is very rare to be seen in all the relationship among leaders in the world. Because when state leaders talk to each other, they seldom talk about the military relationship. But it's not the case with the China-U.S. military relationship. Whenever these leaders talk, you always find they talk about how the Secretary of State should visit China, or how Chinese Vice Chairman of the Central Military Commission should visit the United States. This shows how important this relationship can be, because the military relationship actually lag behind the political and economic relationship, and it probably will doom the relationship, the whole relationship, if we do not take enough care.
But the question is, Senior Colonel Zhou, as you rightly pointed out, what exactly is the reality of the military-to-military exchanges between China and the United States? Is it going to be just makeup for a relationship that has a lot of problems only because we wanted to catch up with the political and economic ties, or there are real necessity between the two militaries and they are willing to have shared aspirations? Those are very two different cases.
Yeah. There is definitely necessity, but people always talk about how vulnerable Sino-U.S. military relationship has been.
It is not?
Well, that is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is how resilient it has been. Because in spite of all this problem, and because of the fact that China and U.S. are not enemies, therefore this is a much more complicated relationship. So that is why the U.S. would still invite China to attend a RIMPAC 2014. That is why China and U.S. would still do a lot of HDR exercises. That is why the U.S. would still want to engage us with peacekeeping as much as possible, and that is why we're still doing counterpiracy in the Gulf of Aden. So it's not a black and white picture. It's much more complicated than that.
Mr. Yuan.
Yeah, I totally agree, Senior Colonel Zhou's point of view. On the one hand, we see the American patrol action in the South China Sea. On the other hand, you can see Chinese military exercises. But this is just one picture. And RIMPAC is another picture. So the first picture is to show the worst scenario preparation work by the two militaries. It's a must. And the RIMPAC activities show that military diplomacy is also important for the two militaries. So that's why many people suggested that on the one hand, the two mil-to-mil relations today is in the best shape in the past 10 years. On the other hand, the two militaries focus on the competition. But today, the fact is that the media focus too much on the later side, rather than nobody mentioned the mil-to-mil, the personal relations. Should be a more balanced, more comprehensive picture.
What do you make of it? Will this ruling be an opportunity or be a crisis for the two military ties between China and the United States? Will people calm down or even more hypered up after this when it comes to the future of these two relations?
It's a decision, a turning point.
That's right.
When leaders can decide to either escalate or de-escalate. I really hope they decide to de-escalate. I've got some very concrete ideas on how to do so. But these are things that have to be worked out primarily between the Philippines and China, because that's where the dispute lies. The U.S. is a bystander, an interested bystander, but it's not a direct participant.
All right, and we're going to continue our discussion about the political relations between China and the United States after the international arbitration ruling on the Philippine issue. We'll be back after this. You're watching Troubled Waters special program World Insight. So, what do you make of the nature of relations between China and the United States, particularly about the issue of territorial disputes reflected this time? What exactly is the end game? Have the two sides a plan, or at least some thoughts about what exactly they want in the Asia-Pacific region? Mr. Paul, from your perspective.
The end game is going to be a long play. It's not going to be one quick event or a few events. It's going to be a process whereby China continues to expand its capacities to protect its interests and to develop more and more far-flung interests away from China's continental base. And the United States is going to continue to remain in the region with its interests and allies and friends and its considerable investments in the Western Pacific. The question is, how do you continue to operate together without becoming part of a a clash, of a conflict. And finding the way forward is like Deng Xiaoping once said about crossing the river by feeling for stones. We don't know the answer right now, but what we hope is that there'll be wise leaders on both sides who will know when to act with restraint as we go forward through this very delicate process.
This is not just crossing the river, this is crossing the sea we are talking about now. Mr. Yuan?
Yes, I think U.S. and China relations is the most comprehensive, most complicated relations in the world. But today, unfortunately, it's highly overshadowed by one single topic, that is the South China Sea issue, overshadowed by the media, hijacked by the third parties, Philippines, Vietnam, the Japanese, etc. But today, it's time for us to back to the right track, to the real nature of the relations of the U.S. and China relations.
But Mr. Yuan, many were suggesting if you were saying that they have been overjacked, overshadowed, then many would wonder what have been the original plan? Do the two capitals know exactly what they want in this big power relations between China and the United States? Do they have a plan? When they anticipate crisis come up, what are their plans? These are, I think, eligible questions we need to ask these days, particularly with the South China Sea territorial dispute.
I think that for the worst scenario, that's the military conflict, we do have, both sides, we do have a plan. That's the two military MOUs signed last year, the year before last year, and the two militaries have some tacit and public agreements for dealing with the worst scenario. But the problem is that for the strategic level, how to accommodate into Asia Pacific as a region, I think it's still a long way to go.
What are our aspirations for one another? What are our understanding of each other's aspirations in the Asia Pacific region? Do we know or do we not? Senior Colonel Zhou.
Very good question. As far as I'm concerned, I would say, talking about the major power relationship, my hope is never how good it will be, but how less risky it could become. And that is a realistic attitude, because the Sino-US relationship is so complicated to an extent. I give an example. After a meeting attended by top experts from both sides, people just ask the same question. Essentially, that is, what do you want?
Right.
Because that confused me so much. It's almost like a religious question. That is, the most simple question becomes the most sophisticated question. So that is to read, how to read correctly the intention of the other side is so difficult.
What do you want and how do you want it? I think those are fundamental questions. So Mr. Paul, you are the important brains in Washington when it comes to U.S.-China relations. What do you want? How do you want it?
Washington is less driven by ambitions of its own. We have a very high-level status quo American presence and influence in the Western Pacific. And I think Americans would like to keep as much of that as they can. And when you talk, as Senior Colonel Zhou has just done, about accommodation, Americans are concerned that accommodation means surrender. And so we have a debate about that. On the other side of this is a lot of American thinking is driven by analysis of what China is up to. And people here are trying to project where does China's growing capability, powered by a still dynamic economy, in the end take China? Is China trying to drive the West out of the Western Pacific, drive the U.S. out? China's leaders say no, that there's room for both. But people drew conclusions when China expanded its landfilling operations in the South China Sea. For many people, especially in our military and defense circuits, they looked at that as a fait accompli, a proof that there's no point in waiting anymore. China has ambitions to drive the U.S. out of the South China Sea, and therefore the U.S. has to pick up the level of effort to protect its presence there. Now, I don't think that's the conclusion of the White House. At least the White House hasn't said that its conclusion is there, but there's certainly powerful voices in Washington articulating this point of view, and it's part of the mix that influences the policies chosen piece by piece and ultimately become an overall strategy.
Mr. Paul, may I follow up by asking you, is that kind of perception natural born? some people just born with that perception. It's hard to change. Or there are things that the Chinese side could do in order to reduce that kind of perception and even change that kind of perception. Mr. Paul.
Well, in the end, we are a collection of 330 million people and with lots of different points of view. But in the end, evidence is sorted through. And if China is sending signals that are fairly China's long-term goals are not inherently adverse to American interests, the U.S. will draw one set of conclusions. If there are mixed signals from China about pushing the U.S. out or diminishing U.S. influence, that'll produce another set of responses from the U.S. It's an ongoing iterative process. It's not something with a conceptual, clear line of demarcation.
Is China aware of the perception it is projecting to the United States, at least to the majority of the United States, like people like Mr. Paul? Or is China at this moment already have a very clear idea of how much it will fight against the U.S. in order to get what they consider as its own sphere?
Well, Mr. Paul, as you have said, there are so many different voices in the United States, and I personally believe the Chinese signal to the U.S. is always consistent. That is, no confrontation and good relationship, and this has been what we want. If you look at all this issue from Chinese perspective, China is not threatening to use force to take back those islands that the Chinese believe are Chinese. The only thing we're doing is to enlarge that we have already taken. So that is the least disturbing effort from our point of view. But then the question is, why would the U.S. come so close to the Chinese islands to exercise so-called freedom of navigation? You know, and I know, that is bullshit, right? Because the South China Sea have so many international recognized sea lanes. You don't have to drive into 12 nautical miles to have your freedom of navigation, right? And what would you think if China would conduct a daily reconnaissance on continental United States? Of course, right now we do not have such capability. But one day, if we have the capability, that would establish a new equilibrium between our armed forces.
Okay, only fair that I'd like you to respond to Mr. Paul briefly.
Well, I think that Senior Colonel Zhou is on the right track, that we need to look teleologically, look out in time as to what we want this shape of the relationship to look like. Tremendous progress has been made in bilateral military-to-military relations since 2012 in the aftermath of the 18th Party Congress in China. That progress has been very consistent and quite professional in organizing things like he mentioned of the memorandums of understanding and the various exercises and the cues. These are really big steps forward. Now, when we were in a long-running confrontation with the Soviet Union, and we did have spying ships and planes close to each other, we came up with the Incidents at Sea Agreement. Now, we're not going to have the same kind of relationship with China that we had with the Soviet Union, but the Incidents at Sea Agreement is not a bad model as ultimately to help to govern the way our two militaries operate near each other, especially near each other's sea lines.
Well, Mr. Yuan, you've been attentive to listen to your two colleagues coming from both China and the U.S. Some smiles even on your face. Come in, please.
I just enjoy this kind of a very candid and direct dialogue.
Absolutely. So you will act the same?
Yeah, actually, in my memory, in 2011 joint statement by both the U.S. and China, the Chinese side very officially admitted the fact that the United States is an Asia-Pacific power. And even if we dislike American bilateral alliance system in the region, but we said we have to face this new reality. But the problem is that America is an Asia-Pacific power. It's not an Asian power. And today, Americans' actions in the region invest too much energy and time and resources in the region, remind us that it's not just a pure Asia-Pacific power, but an Asia power. So this alerts us, which means why do you invest too much energy in the region? Another thing is that we think it's a reality that you have a bilateral military alliances, but we do hope that you play constructive role rather than destructive role.
Mr. Yuan, before I let Mr. Paul to respond to your questions, may I ask you a question as well? Are you suggesting that China is already considered Asia at its own sphere of control, and therefore United States could only become the power of the Asia-Pacific region? In other words, China always say Asia-Pacific is big enough for many to coexist together and also exercise their own power. Is China already making sure of what their spheres is at this moment?
I don't think so. Asia Pacific is big enough for both U.S. and China and other players to play together. This is a very realistic and very constructive concept to show Chinese sincerity when working and living with everybody in the region. But the problem is that Americans just think that Chinese want to kick it out of Asia Pacific region. Actually, we don't have this kind of intention and the capacity. So the problem is that how U.S. and China and other players to sit in together to find a proper way to find how to accommodate with each other in the region.
Mr. Paul.
Well, I think he's said it very well. I believe we've, in recent times, emphasized the military side. It's like when you drive a car. If you only hit the accelerator and add gas and never hit the brakes, you're going to have a problem. You have to be able to do both. And I think that that's kind of a missing element recently. We need more brakes rather than acceleration.
Senior Colonel Zhou?
I think you have.
Is the military the acceleration all the time? No brakes?
Not necessarily. I think we have been doing our best in tandem with American efforts to help this vulnerable but still sustained relationship. In spite of your restriction for bilateral exchange in 12 operational fields, we have been trying our best. So hopefully something more will come. For example, in the peacekeeping and in a bilateral communique, we have touched slightly upon counterterrorism. Of course, it remains to see how we can explore this area, which is very much your strong interest. We'll see how things will unfold.
Mr. Yuan, before we go, we have been hearing from the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in his telephone conversation with his American counterpart, Secretary Kerry, talking about what he called an absolutely important relationship between China and the United States. He is supporting the generally on the sound track relationship between the two countries, and the two sides should further focus on cooperation while properly managing their differences. Of course, you heard these kind of political rhetorics from both sides a lot, but the question is how to translate them into real actions and real thoughts guiding the actions when crises or possibilities of crises come up.
Yeah, even if U.S. and China has some problems, even potential crises in South China Sea and East China Sea and elsewhere, but the general picture is that the two working levels, like Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his counterpart John Kerry and his colleagues, they are doing well, they're working very well. To-meal relations is getting more and more mature. And the most important is that the two top leaders, President Xi and President Obama, they have a very frequent and good working relations. And President Obama is going to visit China in the coming September. I think this kind of a mechanism is a guarantee to the stabilization of the relations. This is the mainstream of the relations.
And we are running out of time, really, gentlemen. I've enjoyed this intellectual journey with all of you. July the 12th, the world is going to hear the so-called international arbitration ruling regarding the South China Sea issue. At this moment, any advice for both Chinese, American, and others who are going to look at those rulings and thinking about the future of the region and even beyond? Let's start from Senior Colonel Zhou.
Well, I hope Filipinos' initiation of the arbitration will provide a chance for the United States to think whether all this is really worthwhile for the U.S. Navy to be in the South China Sea and to worsen our relationship to that extent.
Mr. Yuan?
I hope the Filipino new president take this his predecessor's work and turn to another new page for the Filipino-Chinese relations. I also hope the American side, who wants to play a constructive role in this moment to decrease the political crisis, to keep a low profile in dealing with this case. And if that two conditions met, I think China can make this as a new opportunity.
Okay, Mr. Paul.
Well, I think it's important to take advantage of the July 12 award from the International Tribunal to take the camera back and look at the whole of our relationship and not just focus on the South China Sea. I hope that what we've heard from the new president of the Philippines about neither taunting nor flaunting the outcome of the award will be a starting point for a more constructive and less tension-filled relationship.
Mr. Douglas Paul, Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, and Mr. Yuan Peng. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. We learned a lot. Thank you so much for being with us. And that is all for World Insight special program, Troubled Waters. On Tuesday, July the 12th, we'll bring you a discussion on the South China Sea arbitration after the ruling is issued. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.